Worldwide popularity of blue jeans and most recent renaissance of Japanese indigo could not have been possible without the cultural dominance of America post-World War II. American blue jeans played a huge part in spreading to the world the image of freedom and the rebellion associated with the American brand of democracy. The origin of indigo denim fabric is often disputed, but it is said that it got its start in the port city named Nimes in south of France, when dock workers used weather-beaten cotton canvas from ships' sail to make work clothes. American blue jeans were invented by German immigrant Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis, a Latvian immigrant. They started to make denim work pants for Californian miners during the gold rush of 1850s. These top work pants became enormously popular, then they started to spread to the rest of the country. During and after World War II, American military presence in Europe and in Asia brought all things American to the rest of the world. Hollywood movies and American pop music became the vehicle of soft power. And a youth in a pair of blue jeans became an icon of American freedom and fierce independence. During the Cold War era, American pop culture, including American blue jeans, were banned in a number of countries, including Soviet Union. Dungarees were associated with rebellion against authorities and with political dissidents. In a number of religiously conservative countries, blue jeans symbolize moral and cultural degradation among the youth. Today, denim is mostly a fashion statement with a lifestyle branding thrown in for a good measure. There are subculture of denim enthusiasts who studies vintage denim garments, fascinated by particular design's heritage and its authenticity. More than the end product, I was interested in the characteristic of labor associated with making of the indigo. It required careful planned seasonal labor and the communal workings of experts, yet it was pliable enough for an individual artisan to express something unique, something uniquely his own. That idea of going to a special place to be creative seemed perfectly suited for indigo farming and dyeing. That special place was among indigo farmers and artisans in Japan, and I was lucky enough to experience some part of it. Everything they do for indigo all year round, and at the end, their labor magically materializes in form of blue textile. As someone who lived in New York City with limited space, I wanted to do something with indigo and my home ground. It seemed like near impossible task at first. It seemed like every respectable indigo artisans in the States lived in nature or close to it. After months of considering the possibilities, I realized I would not be able to get Tsukumo bat fermenting in my apartment. I worked with pre-reduced indigo or indigo crystal, a substance made from indigo but chemically altered dye stuff. Indigo crystals eliminated the need for me to keep a Tsukumo vat going inside my apartment. And more importantly, with pre-reduced indigo, I'll be able to indigo dye leather using katazome method. One of the techniques I was especially drawn to was the stencil dyeing method called katazome. Katazome is Japanese dyeing technique where dye-resist paste is applied through a stencil called katagami. When used with indigo, this technique allows repeated pattern to be dyed on fabric. Use of katagami, or the paper stencil, dates back to 8th century Japan, but it was during Edo period, which lasted from 1600s to 1860s, that katazome really flourished as an art form. During Edo period, intricate patterns of katazome cotton was made accessible even for commoners because it was an inexpensive alternative to decorative brocade or patterned woven fabrics. Indigo katazome cloth is visually very flat because of its binary colors. It looks so flat, it almost looks like a sign or a writing on a paper. And the pattern often wore the signifier of the wearer's occupation or his family lineage. I wanted to take that idea and apply it to leather. Not surprisingly, naturally tanned leather resembles human skin. And when indigo is applied to it, it looks almost like tattooed skin. I was fascinated by the look of indigo dyed leather and thought it looked like an extension of human body. Indigo leather, just like human skin, ages over time and it's susceptible to its immediate environment. After a few prototypes, I was eagerly observing the vulnerability of and the changeability of indigo leather over time. Meanwhile, I looked for examples of katazome indigo leather in history and tried to find any relevant techniques, but I didn't find much. There are examples of dyed leather trims and armors. There are examples of deerskin decorated with lacquer, but curiously, there were very little examples of cowhide dyed with katazome method. Then it dawned on me that it was never produced because it would be too expensive for the dyers. In traditional dye houses, vats containing indigo dye was sustained for anywhere from several months to several years. With careful feeding of bacteria and sensitive balancing of the pH balance of the dye bath, the longevity of indigo vat had a direct impact on the productivity of the dye house. Leather, unlike cotton, exhausted dye bath very quickly. I suspect leather dyeing was not economically viable for the dye houses. Today, most commercially available indigo dye comes from India. Indigo plants native of India has much higher pigment content than Japanese indigo plants. So the pigment extraction from Indian indigo plant to pre-reduced indigo is much less labor intensive than that of Japanese indigo. This also means indigo from India is far less expensive than Japanese indigo. I've heard many times that Japanese indigo color is superior to that of indigo coming from India or Africa, but personally I don't agree. But I do think the human labor intensive process associated with Japanese indigo made Japanese indigo much more precious to the people who work with Japanese indigo. During World War II, Japanese government banned indigo farming as part of war effort because it wasn't a food crop. This ban exacerbated the economic downturns of indigo farms. Since indigo was an annual plant, indigo farmer would plant indigo in hiding so they can ensure the survival of farm's heirloom specimen. Indigo farms continued to disappear all through 20th century, mostly due to economical unviability of indigo. Currently in Japan, only a handful of larger indigo farms are operating. Unless you farm Japanese indigo and make tsukumo yourself, tsukumo isn't available for those living outside Japan. Working with Japanese indigo in its original form is not easily available for outsiders. Living as an artisan or an indigo farmer was difficult in the past, and it is still difficult. These days, in order to make the reasonable living as an artisan, you have to market the image. But I rarely saw real masters putting themselves on display because they're too busy, and usually they're not keen on showing their workspace to strangers. An artisan may work with others, but out of necessity and not by choice. He'd rather have his work speak for him than having to speak for himself. Due to how idea of artisan is consumed these days, an introverted craftsman has far less chance of being commercially viable. He may not be Instagram ready, and he may have a very messy studio, and he may not speak the language of cultural elitists who might be ignorant of the craft itself. A few years ago, I found myself in a brightly lit, messy basement studio in Seoul, Korea. I went to Korea to seek out shoemakers who was willing to work with indigo dyed leather. There I found myself among half dozen master shoemakers, each with 20 to 40 years of experience. The head of workshop, Mr. E, enjoyed a degree of commercial success in the 70s and 80s until cheap mass-produced shoes started to flood the market in the 90s. Many of the highly skilled shoemakers had to quit because they no longer could make a living. Without some financial safety net, all the skills and the knowledge would disappear from the industry. These stories were all too familiar. Despite not so glamorous look of Mr. E's workshop and his men, I was able to come back to New York with 9 pairs of beautiful boots, each pair thoughtfully made for comfort and longevity. Prior to traveling to Korea from New York for the boots, I had attempted to work with 2 local shoemakers in New York City. They had far less experience than Korean shoemakers, but they had learned their trade in Europe and had a very beautiful looking studio in Brooklyn. Unfortunately, they were more interested in making name for themselves than in making shoes. Like a few of the denim heads I encountered in the past, these Brooklyn shoemakers seem to value heritage and provenance over quality and craftsmanship. Artisans in contemporary times face 2 major challenges. First is making their craft commercially viable when mass-produced products are the norm. Second challenge is operating in the world where the shallow understanding of craftsmanship is reinforced by cultural classicism and the unwitting cronyism of some elitists. There are no easy answers, but as always, the best of creativity manages to find solutions. Like all things do, craft adapt and changes with changing world. All the technology available today opens door to do more and push the boundaries. The idea about authenticity, appropriation, and sustainability continues to evolve. I love the fact I can take the tradition of Japanese indigo dyeing, then add something new to it. I'm very grateful that I learned about indigo through humble artisans who humbled me with their dedication. And I'm glad to have known each of their unique life stories that gives intangible beauty found in indigo blue.